Well, good morning. It's wonderful to be with you. I always love being in worship with you, and also the opportunity to hear Daniel G. play the cello. Daniel, thank you, wherever he went. But boy, one of my favorite experiences from the Christmas festival was sitting in a place where I could actually watch Daniel as he played the cello, because it's one of my favorite aesthetic experiences, and just so grateful for his gifting. Why do I appreciate Daniel on the cello? I actually played the cello for 7 years, and the reason I have such vast appreciation for Daniel is he plays it so beautifully, and I did not. I had the privilege of attending the memorial service yesterday for Nick Davis, and boy, what a hard but beautiful service. Just so many emotions tied up with that. Feelings that we have for the family, feelings that we have for so many of you who knew and loved Nick. His parents told me that they'll be on campus later this spring, and they're planning to attend commencement in May. And so we'll have time to think about how to honor Nick appropriately and to reflect together on this tragedy that has definitely invaded our life. One of the things that I believe about pain and suffering is that none of us ever suffer to the same depth and intensity all at the same time. And I think that God has created us with a capacity for community, and part of the reason we need community is that those of you who were close to Nick or close to those who were close to Nick are going to take this very hard. And those of us who live life with empathy and truly care for you and love you are here to come alongside you and to be a source of support and encouragement as you walk through one of the most difficult life experiences you'll ever face. But I was so pleased to be at the service, to hear from some of your classmates, to hear his pastor, to hear from his family members, his younger brother, his older brother-in-law, and to just capture a sense of the spirit that was in Nick, his love of the Lord, his love and dedication to friendship, and his great sense of the adventure of life. We'll definitely miss him. In getting ready for our chapel this morning, I wanted to talk to you about the importance of learning to imitate Christ, of learning to come into a relationship with Christ in such a way that we become like him. And the goal of life is certainly for our life to count, for it to matter. And so often we sort around for how we can make this a reality. We start out, we have questions, we have confidences that take us a certain direction, inclinations, people affirm us, and pretty soon we're headed down a path. But as we go down that path, we begin to recognize that there are things that really matter and things that don't count at all. And we have to sort those out. And I often think that so much of life is learning how to assess what really matters and what doesn't count at all. The passage that I've selected for this morning is taken from Ephesians 5, 1-5. Just listen as I read it for you this morning. I think it's up on the screen overhead. Be imitators of God, therefore, as dearly loved children, and live a life of love, just as Christ loved us and gave himself up for us as a fragrant offering and sacrifice to God. But among you there must not even be a hint of sexual immorality or of any kind of impurity or of greed, because these are improper for God's holy people. Nor should there be obscenity, foolish talk, or coarse jesting, which are out of place, but rather thanksgiving. For of this you can be sure, no immoral, impure, or greedy person, such a person is an idolater, has any inheritance in the kingdom of Christ and of God. Well, when you think about this passage, there's so many themes that are running, but three that I really want to elevate are, first and foremost, the importance of being imitators. What does the word imitate mean? It means to mimic. And I often think that we have to start out by mimicking. Now, if you end up just being simply a mimicker of other people, that's not a very good way to live. When I was an undergraduate, one of my spiritual heroes was Richard Foster, and many of you have read his work. I had the privilege of writing Longing for God with Richard, and he has had a huge mark on my adult life. But I remember when we were in college, everybody wanted to be like Richard. They wanted to know God like Richard. They even wanted to look like Richard. Now, if you've seen Richard, that's something that you shouldn't aspire to. But people began to grow Richard Foster beards. I didn't. I was an athlete. I had to shave. But it was so humorous to me to watch people who so badly wanted to be like Richard, because the longing was really to have the relationship that Richard represented, the relationship with God. But the best we could do was really to mimic Richard. Now, I think in some respects that's exactly what Paul is saying, is you have to start out by mimicking or imitating people who are in this life and are living this life. But that isn't the ultimate goal. The ultimate goal is to become like Christ, so that when people experience us, they experience just a foreshadowing of what it must have been like to experience Christ. And then, secondly, to live a life of love. The Greek phrase really literally means to have all of the activities of your life be an expression of love. Now, you think about how you go through your day, even as you've gone through your day today. In what ways have you lived a life of love? In what ways has your very activity been a reflection or an expression that at the core of your being, you have an overwhelming sense of the love of God that gives you love for other people? And as you go back through your day, if you were to reflect on it tonight, what would you see of the day? Would you see all of the times that you expressed a life of love? And would you also see the times in which you ignored people or said a curt phrase or deliberately tried to put somebody else down? Well, these are ways in which we have to learn how to imitate Christ, not simply so that we'll just mimic the behavior, but so that we'll come to embody the very love and spirit of Jesus. And then finally, inheritance, to receive all the spiritual riches from those who have gone before us. How do we receive the inheritance of the kingdom of Christ and of God? We have to become familiar with those who are deeper in the faith, who have been living it a longer time, who can point us in the direction that actually helps us see the ways of God. Now, one of the great saints of the church is Ignatius of Loyola. And as you know, and as you've heard me say before, many of you know that I'm a rut person, and I read, and I love to read, and I will get reading in a rut, and it can go for some time. And then I'll get to points where I just go, I wonder what else was going on. Well, I had one of these experiences. I had been reading Calvin and Luther. Now, that's not a cartoon. Those are theologians. And if you have an opportunity to take some of the great professors and great classes that deal with theology and church history, you will come to appreciate these fountainheads of the Great Reformation. Well, I was reading Luther and Calvin, and even though I had read Ignatius and had even been through a modified retreat based on the spiritual exercises, I had never even thought about the fact that Ignatius was actually alive during the same time as Luther and Calvin. And so as I began to recognize this, I wanted to begin to understand Ignatius. Here was a man who was living, his life overlapped directly with Luther and Calvin. He even studied at the University of Paris during the time that Calvin was in France and would eventually be banned from France. He was a part of the Counter-Reformation that was literally against the thoughts of Luther and Calvin. But in the midst of this, one of the great concerns of his life was, how do I become like Christ? And if you know anything of his biography, you know that he was a very vain man. For the first 30 years of his life, he says, I lived a life of wanton self-indulgence. I was very handsome. He thought quite highly of his appearance. He loved to fight other people's fights, and so he would be hired as a mercenary. But in 1521, at the age of 30, he was in a battle, and he was severely wounded. One leg was broken, the other was just, virtually beyond repair. He had to undergo several surgeries on the leg without any kind of anesthesia. And the descriptions of it are just gruesome. And what we know is that it ended up taking 2 years for him to recover fully. But during this time of terrible injury and pain, this time of rehabilitation, he had a powerful encounter with God, and he began to rethink his entire life. And as he thought back through his life, he writes, if I were to die now, I will die never having lived. My life will not have counted. And he determines in that moment that his life is going to count. And he begins to think about, how can I live life in such a way that my life will in fact really matter? And he reads several things, including The Life of Christ by a leading thinker from a century earlier that had really put these thoughts together. This book, The Life of Christ, actually was based on several reflections on different stories from the life of Jesus. And this actually gave Ignatius the idea that would become a part of the spiritual exercises, which is simply that we read the Gospels and actually enter into the scenes from the Gospels with a vivid imagination so that we can see ourselves in the story. Who would we be if we were in the crowd? How would we respond to Jesus? Would we be a part of the group that's for him? Would we be a part of the group that's against him? And so he begins to think through all of these different vignettes from the life of Christ, and he begins to reflect on their importance for his own life. And out of this, he writes the spiritual exercises, and this is what he says about them. He essentially says that, I got ahead of myself, what he wanted to do was he wanted to find the great middle way. And I love this line. He said, I looked to the right, I saw all of the religious enthusiasts, didn't want to be like them. Looked to the left, saw all the dead intellects, didn't want to be like them. The religious enthusiasts were people who chased after every experience of God. The dead intellects were those who just thought up great ideas about God but had none of the living reality of God evident in their life. And he said, I wanted to pursue the great middle way that would balance a vivid experience of Christ with these rich ideas about God and Christ. And this became the great middle way. Now, when I think about what I want for you, that is what I want for you. I want you to have a living reality of Christ evident in your life, but I also want you to have the thought structure so that you can think deliberately about what does it mean to be a follower of Christ and how can you grow in that. Out of this came the spiritual exercises, and the way in which Ignatius referred to them, the spiritual exercises are all the best that I have been able to think out, experience, and understand in this life, both for helping somebody to make the most of themselves, as well as being a profit to others. Now, isn't that a great line? So that we can become all that God created us to be, but also so that we can be useful. Now, I often think about if that is a goal for each one of us, what a great difference we can make in our life. Now, he would eventually write these along the lines of a 30-day retreat, and it would follow the pattern that had been ingrained in the history of the church for 1,000 years, which was called essentially the writings or the works of Pseudo-Dionysius, based on this threefold way: purgation, illumination, and union. Now, what is purgation? That's just such an ancient term, but you can tell from even its root. To purge, to free ourselves of moral indecency. Purgation is the process by which we undergo moral reform. And Ignatius said for us to really prepare our hearts and minds to embody the life of Christ, we have to be able to really undergo moral reformation. And so he says, what happens to us is that we sin. And he picks up this idea from Evagrius that I've talked about earlier, where sin originates in our thought life. And Ignatius would talk about the difference between venial and mortal sins. A venial sin is one that simply your mind wanders to things that you would do, you'd like to do, you entertain doing, but to do them, you know it would actually bring, it would be sinful and it would be moral, it would bring moral harm to your soul. And so he said those are in one category, and those are actually things we need to deal with. But the more severe is when our thought life gives rise to behavior that actually ruins us. And so he talks about the difference between venial sins and mortal sins so that we'll begin to get a sense of what does it mean for us to entertain wrongdoing and what does it mean for us to actually act upon it. He compares this to Adam and Eve, who were tempted. They didn't have to act on their temptation, but they did. Or Cain, who's contemplating murdering Abel, and God says, sin is lurking at your door. Meaning sin is really there tempting you. You don't have to do it, but you decide to do it. And so from that, Ignatius begins to think through for us, or to help us, invite us to think through for ourselves, what are the ways in which we give rise to ideas that actually lead us off path? And if you know the most conventional or classic term for sin, it's hamartia. It's a term taken from archery, and it means simply to miss the mark. And the implication that Ignatius lays down for us is that to sin, to enter into sin, either with our thought life or with our whole being, is simply to begin to miss the mark for what God intended for us. And often we look at sin and we say that's such outdated language, I want to use something more modern or contemporary. But, you know, the word itself, the description itself, really describes so many contemporary realities. There's a destiny for our life, and we should pursue it. There's a life that honors God, and the reason it honors God is because it leads to the best ends. And those who get on that path and begin to walk towards God experience that reality. But those who veer off course, they begin down a path that will ultimately land them missing the mark. They will miss the destiny that God has for them. Now, the second is illumination. And I like his treatment of illumination because it brings to mind the sense of Matthew 13. Why do you talk to them in parables? Jesus says, I talk to them in parables so that those who have spiritual discernment can see, and those who don't will miss the entire meaning. Now, one of the great objectives of both moral and intellectual education is that all of us, each of us, will develop a capacity to gain perceptual insight, that we can look at the same realities but begin to see the deeper meaning that is involved. Now, one of my favorite paintings, a painting that I actually bought for my office, was painted by Sue Savage. And I think we're at a place, how many of you have seen this painting or know Sue's work? What do you see there? What is that? But what color bowl? What's that? A mirror. Somebody said a silver bowl. We had a silver bowl. How many would say it's a silver bowl? It's a trick question. Thank you. Thank you for just falling right into my story. That's what I said. When I said, Sue, that's the most beautiful silver bowl. I just love that. It's so evocative, sacramental. And she smiled because she was hoping I would say that. Silver is not a color. So there is literally no silver in this painting. And if you want to come to my office and stare at the painting, as have I, to try and find just that fleck of silver, it doesn't exist. Now, this is the way in which our minds work. We look at that, and because Sue has done such a masterful job at painting reflections into the bowl, our mind tells us that it is a silver bowl. Now, and if we were actually seeing it on the table, we would see it that way. But there is no silver in the picture. It is the reflection, and it is our mind filling in all of those blanks because we see the reflection painted so well. It reminds us of a silver bowl, or it embodies a silver bowl. Well, I think this is such a beautiful analogy of what it means to come to see reality accurately. That so many ways our life becomes a reflection of a greater reality. And people begin to get a sense of what does it mean to be a Christian by the way in which we reflect the life of Christ. If you were to look at this painting, it just is so evocative. And there are times when I get moments in my day, I'll look across the room at it, and I just think about the fact that what are the ways in which my life and the realities of my life are a reflection of the ultimate outcome of my life. And when you take a moral inventory, or when you're praying, or you're pausing and thinking about the ultimate outcome of your life, what are the ways in which the activities of your life begin to reflect the ultimate outcome of your life? This is to begin to develop a deeper capacity to actually understand both the way in which life works and the greater goal that God has for you. Now, Ignatius ends by saying the ultimate goal is to become like Christ, to become united with Christ, both in his death and in his resurrection. And the idea that Ignatius picks up here is a classical one and certainly disputed and sometimes, wrangled over. But the greater idea, which I think all of us feel compelled to embrace, is the idea that ultimately the purpose of life is to fully reflect the glory of God and the way in which that glory is embodied in the life of Jesus. For Ignatius, our imitation of Christ is meant to be a full-bodied expression of the life and spirit of Jesus. We are to become vessels of love in order to be agents of change in our world. Now, the movement for which Ignatius is known is the Jesuit movement. And this was the ultimate outcome and honestly the enduring legacy of his pioneering understanding of how we become like Christ. And the goal of the Jesuit movement was to educate you both morally and intellectually, to develop in you a deep capacity to love God and also a deep capacity to know God. And out of that loving and knowing, for you to go anywhere in the world and to become a full expression of the love and service of Jesus. The goal of the Jesuits is literally to be capable of being dropped off anywhere in the world and being bright enough to figure out how to work effectively and be loving enough to draw others to Christ. Now, I think this is a great goal and a great ambition of the Christian life and of those of us who have dedicated our life to both the character of Christ and the mind of God. And it's an invitation that I put before you this morning that as you think about your life and you think about even the tragedies that are stalking our community, that force us to think together about what is the destiny and purpose of our life, that we think about the ways in which we can become an embodiment both of the love of God and of the mind of God. May God be with you.